I am Martha King, Vice President of Programs and Projects for Farm Foundation. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of our virtual conference on trade and climate change. As a reminder, each session of this conference will include simultaneous interpretation in English and French. Please ensure you have selected the correct language that you will listen in, either English or French. To select the appropriate language, please locate and click on the globe icon on the bottom taskbar of this window, or more if you are on a mobile device, and select either English or French. For those of you who joined us on Wednesday, you already had the opportunity to learn a little bit more about Farm Foundation and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and our collaboration on this conference. However, we'd like to take a few moments to provide that introduction to those who may be joining us for the first time this morning or who missed it on Wednesday morning. I'd now like to introduce Sherry Rogie-Fidler, President and CEO of Farm Foundation, and Ted Billier, Chief Strategy Officer for the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, to share their comments. Sherry?
Thank you, Martha, and good morning, everyone. Welcome back to those who attended day 1 of the conference, and welcome to those who are joining for the first time today. As Martha mentioned, this conference is a joint initiative of Farm Foundation and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and builds on recent collaborations between our 2 organizations, one focusing on trade and the environment in 2019, and one on managing trade in an increasingly chaotic world in 2020. We are so glad to have the opportunity to continue the conversation on agricultural trade and critical global issues with this conference. As Martha mentioned, my name is Sherry Rogie-Fidler, and I'm the President and CEO of Farm Foundation, located just outside of Chicago, Illinois. We are, of course, thrilled to be working once again with our partners at CAPI to bring you this conference, and would like to share just a bit about our organizations before we get started today. Farm Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we are an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. The 3 levers we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Conferences such as this are just one part of our extensive program of work. We pursue programs and projects that align with our 4 strategic priorities, which you can see on this slide: farmer health, digital agriculture, conservation and sustainability, and market development and access. People are at the center of everything we do as we strive to create multi-stakeholder and intergenerational collaborations on a local, national, and global scale. You can learn more about Farm Foundation and our work by visiting our website at farmfoundation.org or connecting with us on our social media platforms. We rely on partnerships to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about funding or partnering with us, I invite you to reach out and explore collaboration. I'd now like to turn things over to Ted Billier to share a few comments. Ted?
Thank you, Sherry, and good morning. My name is Ted Billier, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI, located in Ottawa, Canada. CAPI is pleased to partner with the Farm Foundation again on critical conversations around global agricultural trade. CAPI is an independent policy think tank focusing solely on the agri-food sector, bringing insight, evidence, and creative solutions to agri-food policymakers by creating venues like this for critical conversations, explaining research results to a broader audience, and being a connector between those who have creative ideas to contribute and those who are making impactful policy decisions. You can learn more about the work CAPI is doing through our website or social media platforms. There are many ways to support the work of CAPI, and we are actively seeking funding partners on our work going forward. If you're interested in learning more or want to get in touch, please visit the CAPI website to reach out and start the conversation. Now I'll pass it over to Sherry to tell you more about what to expect from today's agenda. Sherry?
Great, thanks, Ted. We are excited to continue these conversations on agricultural trade in the context of climate change. We have 3 final sessions today exploring diverse topics. Day 2 begins with session 4 of the conference, Trade Policy Expert Outlook, Climate Actions and Trade, with trade policy experts discussing their views on how climate change policies in the US, Canada, and Mexico will need to interact in order to comply with the rules-based system in this new area of policy. In session 5, Industry Outlook, Climate Actions and Trade, we will hear how industry is playing its part in addressing climate change within the context of sustainability and trade. Session 6, Trade Policy and Climate Measurement Implications, will bring trade policy, climate, and measurement together. Panelists will look ahead for the key trade and climate policy initiatives and the critical role that measurement will play. And now I will turn things back over to Martha for a few logistical reminders.
Thank you, Ted and Sherry. For those of you joining us for the first time this morning, I'd like to highlight a few reminders and helpful tips for getting the most out of the conference. The Event Hub is your starting point for all sessions. Once you're in the Event Hub, you will see a list of the day's sessions. Click the blue View Session button next to each session to join it. And remember, you must join each session individually. When one session ends, you must exit that session, go back to the Event Hub, and click the View Session button for the next session you want to join. We are very excited to have a suite of tools and technologies available to help this meeting feel as interactive as possible. We encourage you to use the Q&A function within each session that allows you to ask questions of the presenters. Our virtual networking lounge will be open throughout the day and can be used for small group conversations and discussions. To join the networking lounge, join from the Event Hub as you will every other session by clicking the blue View Session button. Please be advised that the networking lounge is not tablet compatible. This means if you are using an iPad for the rest of the meeting, you will need to switch to a desktop, laptop, or phone to join the networking lounge. When you enter the networking lounge for the first time, you'll be asked to input your name and email address. Once you are in the networking lounge, you can join a virtual table to informally chat with others. There is a help desk in the bottom or top right corner of the screen that you can go to if you need any assistance in the lounge. Additionally, if you need assistance throughout the you can email events@farmfoundation.org. Finally, if you are posting on social media during the event, please tag your posts with #FF. As a reminder on the schedule, all times listed in the agenda are in Central Daylight Time. Today's sessions end at 4 o'clock p.m., though the networking lounge will remain open until 5 o'clock. Now it's time to get today's session started. If you're just joining us, an important reminder about language interpretation. Each session of this conference will include simultaneous interpretation in English and French. Please ensure you have selected the correct language that you will listen in, either English or French. To select the appropriate language, please locate and click on the globe icon on the bottom taskbar of this window, or more if you are on a mobile device, and select either English or French. And just another quick reminder that you can use the Q&A tab to ask questions during this session. I would now like to welcome back Joe Glauber, Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Institute, who will moderate this morning's first session. Joe?
Great, thanks, Martha, and thanks to Farm Foundation and Cappy, for organizing this event. I think it's very timely, obviously, and I enjoyed Wednesday's session, but we really are looking forward to just a blockbuster panel today. As Martha said, I'm Joe Glauber. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and spent a lot of years at U.S. Department of Agriculture and President's Council of Economic Advisors and the U.S. Trade Reps Office. And so I'm really glad to be back moderating this particular panel. In this session, trade policy experts familiar with the USMCA, governing trade between US, Canada, and Mexico, will present their views on how climate change policies in these three countries will need to interact in order to comply with a rules-based system in this new policy area. We have a great panel, and I'll introduce them more fully in a minute, but we're going to start with Darci Vetter, who's Vice Chair at Agriculture, Food, and Trade General Manager and Public Affairs at Edelman. She'll be followed by Kenneth Smith-Ramos, who's a partner in Agon, and then finally Jonathan Freed, who's a senior advisor with Albright Stonebridge. Again, I'll give them a more detailed introduction in a minute, and there's one certainly in the package that's on their website as well. But I think as we saw on Wednesday, and as we'll see certainly later today as we get into more specific policies that the private sector is offering and also what the government is considering, that international interest in repurposing policies towards reduction of greenhouse gas emissions or sequestering carbon are certainly getting a lot of interest. And I think one of the main issues that many of us are asking is, how are these policies going to be consistent with trade rules? I can highlight 3 separate areas, and I think we'll get into some of these in the discussions that follow, but starting with something like international standards, because we are seeing a number of policies being put forward or being discussed that would reduce policies that would encourage the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions or sequester carbon. And so you do get these issues like measurement issues in terms of how much carbon is that recognized by trading partners and other things. This is particularly relevant in terms of meeting international goals of reducing greenhouse gases. I know we're going to, Robert Bonney and others are going to be on a panel at the end of the day that are going to be discussing this in more detail, but it's certainly the whole issues of additionality and verifiability and permanence are all sort of tied up in these issues. And again, some of them are very technical, but they make a difference when we're talking about setting international standards. They also have, the second thing would be implications for border measures. And, if we see countries putting standards on producers or others to encourage certain practices, how will that affect trade at the border? So imports, will they be affected? We're already seeing this, of course, in a variety of other forums. On Wednesday, a discussion arose over the EU's new proposal, the Farm to Fork initiative, and on sustainability and how that might impact trade, or recent moves, for example, in Mexico to address GMOs. These are all have potential implications at the border, and I think our panel is very well equipped to address them. And then lastly, is this whole issue is, if we're going to be repurposing agricultural subsidies, a question remains of whether or not these subsidies are production distorting and hence trade distorting. And so while a lot of people look at border measures as, well, are they science-based or are they just protectionist measures, so too do you look at subsidies to encourage environmental or other sorts of goals. That's all well and good, but if indeed they're impacting trade and we're seeing more production flowing to being exported to other things, do these things constitute subsidies? And again, I think that the whole issue, this brings in things like the WTO and the agreement on agriculture, and whether or not these policies are consistent with so-called green box measures, or do these rules, the existing rules, need to be changed to address these? Well, I think rather than hear from me on this, I'd like to really hear from the panel. And so I'm going to start first with Darci Vetter. And I think a lot of people know Darci very well here in the US, at least, that she is currently, as I mentioned earlier, the general manager at Edelman, dealing with food and ag and trade. And she's also a diplomat in residence at the University of Nebraska, where she has been instrumental to launching the Yider Institute in International Trade and Finance. She served for during particularly the second part of the Obama administration, as the chief ag negotiator at USTR. She was also a deputy undersecretary at USDA, and for many years was a trade policy expert at the U.S. Trade Rep's office. So welcome, Darci, and I'll give you the floor.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Thanks to CAPI and Farm Foundation and my fellow panelists. It's fun to be in a group with folks I've worked with in the past talking about these very important issues. And I think it's a very timely panel. We coordinated a bit beforehand and talked about all the ways we can look at sort of the USMCA and the regional trade relationship with Canada, Mexico, and the US. And I elected to go first and actually talk about the mechanics of trade agreements a little bit and what implications that has for the region and dealing with climate change and how those agreements themselves function and operate. And I think in the United States, at least, the fact that the words climate change don't actually appear in the text of the USMCA got a lot of attention, in part because Vice President Harris voted against the USMCA for that very reason, that she didn't feel that the agreement itself leaned into what was one of the biggest, perhaps the existential issue, the biggest environmental issue that we face. But I think it is important to remember that while we are, and I think discussion around trade agreements and trade rules and climate change now sort of jump right to, will border type measures comply with trade rules? Will they be in harmony or in conflict? But I think it's worth looking at the structure of agreements themselves and thinking about how some of the mechanics and the obligations in our trade agreements position agriculture better to deal with what are really important challenges related to climate change, both in adapting to it and in mitigating future climate change. And in thinking about USMCA as opposed to NAFTA or other earlier in time trade agreements, there's a lot of language in there that is much more forward-looking. And typically when we talk about obligations in trade agreements, we talk about it in terms of what's enforceable. How will we hold countries accountable to the provisions on the page? What I think is interesting, if you look at the evolution of our trade agreement language, is that there's a lot more now that's sort of forward-looking and encouraging parties to prepare themselves for future change in a way that will retain sort of that regional alliance. And so I just wanted to point out some of those things as a springboard then for the rest of our discussion. So next slide, please. And the first real challenge that I think is on the mind of many in a COVID world, of course, is the additional pressure that we will see as the climate changes from human health and on plant and animal diseases as well. We know that trade is a vector for moving invasive species, for moving plant and animal disease, for impacting human health. And the more we trade, the more opportunities are that those pests go with the goods and services and the people that travel. But we also know that climate change is accelerating the spread of those diseases as well, making it, tropical diseases showing up in subtropical zones, where those different organisms can thrive is changing. And so sanitary and phytosanitary measures are increasingly important, and being able to move quickly and in a coordinated fashion to implement good SPS measures will be increasingly important for human health, but also for protecting agricultural productivity. And if you look back at NAFTA, sort of what was governing the regional trade, and frankly, the WTO looks a lot like the SPS agreement, looks a lot like NAFTA. They were being negotiated sort of around the same time. You see the basics, which is that countries can sort of set their own levels of protection. They should base those measures on science and risk, that when you take measures that will restrict trade for a genuine and important purpose, like protecting human, animal, and plant health, that's fine, but you should do it in the way that's the least trade restrictive necessary to achieve that level of protection. And of course, there was an SPS committee established to look at how countries were implementing the rules and to talk about coordination on issues. If you go to the text of the USMCA, much of which is very similar to the CPTPP text, or the original TPP that of course the US participated in at that point, you see a little bit more emphasis on the how. How is it that countries will get to develop and implement these policies, but also to the regional approach? And I think some of these are particularly important for positioning us to deal with increased pressure and climate change. There is specific emphasis on regionalization. That is recognizing parts of countries that are disease-free, even if particular diseases exist. We've seen a lot of discussion in that on avian influenza. You might have an outbreak in Minnesota, but the rest of the country is fine. Let's work together to make sure that US poultry trade as a whole is not interrupted. I think that's going to be increasingly important, again, as we see sort of the zones where diseases may be established and how they move. If you look at a country like the United States, Florida's conditions are very different than North Dakota's. And so working together and sharing information on adapting to those conditions will be important. USMCA added a lot of language specifically on conducting audits and import checks and using scientific methods and sampling and making sure that you're doing due diligence at the border, but also doing it in a way that's methodologically sound and based on risk. So you're not delaying, for example, shipments of perishable agricultural products. But there's also some important language in that part of the agreement on trying to align methodologies, align sampling procedures, implementing quality controls. I think the knowledge that we are gaining from that sampling, what we are finding, increased pressures from other places, that's also important information for us to share. To me, I see opportunities for using things like predictive analytics, sharing them regionally, and figuring out how we need to be refining our SPS measures as we watch threats coming in a different way from other regions of the world. And when you look at diseases like African swine fever, clearly putting pressure and a real concern to the pork industries in each of our 3 countries, early warning for each other using best sampling is important. And of course, there's still an SPS committee, but what's sort of different about older agreements versus the new ones is that they actively envision the US, Mexico, and Canada working together to develop proposals, to share information, and then to jointly be interacting with the WTO and with the standard setting bodies for SPS, the International Plant Protection Convention, the OIE, and the Codex. So, really as a region, thinking about what policies we need to protect food safety and plant and animal health. And of course, the USMCA also establishes technical working groups to really dig into specific areas of SPS concern and bring that back to the SPS committee. So again, a chance to be more proactive under the auspices of a trade agreement where you will already have both trade and technical experts at the table. Next slide, please. And of course, so you can't talk about trade agreements and climate change without thinking about the environmental provisions of these agreements. And there's a big change between NAFTA and USMCA in terms of how environment provisions are dealt with, in that NAFTA, being a very early trade agreement for the US, put environment and labor inside agreements instead of part of the fully enforceable text of the agreement itself. The focus of that side agreement was really on development and enforcement of clear environmental standards. Real concern at the time NAFTA was brought forward that countries would engage in a race to the bottom, prioritize trade over environmental protection. It had a real focus on environmental cooperation, both for enforcing rules, but also, developing and building joint capacity to implement environmental protection, but also had this Commission on Environmental Cooperation that had a submission procedure where citizens could directly bring forward concerns about lack of enforcement or environmental issues in the 3 countries, and force the development of reports by the Commission that would bring some needed transparency and pressure on governments to do better. If you look to the USMCA, that Commission on Environmental Cooperation and cooperative approach, as well as that opportunity for public participation, is maintained. But the environmental provisions and obligations are brought into the agreement. They're part of the full text. They're fully enforceable. And very specifically, certain multilateral environmental agreements were referenced in NAFTA. More of them are referenced in USMCA, that countries should uphold them and meet those measures. But what's really interesting, I think, about the USMCA text is there's 15 different sections talking about cooperative work that will happen on a whole range of topics. So everything from marine litter to forestry policy, to fishery subsidies and the standards the 3 countries will hold themselves to, which again forms a real basis for negotiating as a region in the WTO, where we hope to see those measures adopted permanently, discussion of invasive species, which of course is very related to trade. And of course, we've just seen in the past week some momentum from the US Congress to trying to really push through an environmental goods agreement in the WTO. You see cooperation within USMCA on trying to foster greater trade in environmental goods among the three parties that could help with those efforts as well. Next slide, please. And there's another chapter that I find interesting in USMCA, and it's a chapter almost nobody talks about in our trade agreements, in the competitiveness chapter. And it's usually a spot where you talk about how do you make sure that the benefits of trade are shared among the populations in the countries that are party to it? So outreach to small and medium-sized industry, to different sectors of the economy. In TPP, the competitiveness chapter really looked at supply chains and integration throughout the region and making sure that we were paying attention and fostering better trade throughout the region. But the USMCA, which I think is really a product of the politics of the time it was negotiated, the competitiveness chapter focuses on retaining manufacturing in North America and trying to keep as much of the production in the region, again, a real priority of the previous administration, but also incentivizing and attracting investment to the region. And under that particular umbrella, there's specific language that talks about identifying priority projects and policies to develop a modern physical and digital trade infrastructure. And Joe has really alluded to this already, that it's precisely the sharing of information, the common tactics for measurement, enabling markets where you could be trading carbon credits across borders. We have the auspices within USMCA to bring together different types of experts who will look at this as both a trade, a climate, and an agriculture problem built into the trade agreement. And of course, there's also language on promoting cooperative activities with respect to innovative technology, whether that might be things like how CRISPR could contribute to climate change, or some of those very important sensors and other technologies needed to measure carbon sequestration, to enable digital trade and marketing and the free flow of environmental goods and services and those credits themselves. So last slide here. I think that there are numerous opportunities within the infrastructure of our trade agreements, and specifically within the infrastructure of USMCA. We have a quarter of a century of working on really regionalizing our economies, integrating our economies. We're good at measuring all sorts of goods and services that go back and forth. I think we could use USMCA as an opportunity to pilot some of the types of border measures, the measurement of carbon, how that affects goods across the border by using some of this infrastructure. And then we could share that experience with the broader global community who's grappling with the same problem. So I think there are real opportunities here. The question is whether the policies around climate and frankly other things involving agricultural trade, if those policies continue to be in alignment to position us for that kind of forward-looking activity, and whether there is the political will to do some of the experimenting and piloting of these things on a regional basis. And so, again, I think potential is there. Now we have to figure out how to harness it. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Joe.
Thanks, Darcy. That was excellent. And it really sets the stage, I think. Our next speaker is Smith-Ramos, who is, as I mentioned, is a partner at Agon, which is a Mexican consulting firm that specializes in competition, regulatory affairs, and international trade. I think, as many people know, Ken served as Mexico's chief NAFTA negotiator in the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement, which led to the USMCA, or all the other acronyms, depending on which country you're from. But what people probably know less of is that Ken really was at the forefront of resolving a lot of thorny issues. I mean, Ken was doing agriculture, but he was doing a lot of the other areas within NAFTA, particularly the automotive rules of origin provisions, which were very thorny, and I think that Ken was really a leader there in getting a resolution and really resolving that and getting an agreement at the end. Ken served in numerous positions in the Mexican government, including most recently, he was representing the Ministry of Economy at the Embassy of Mexico here in Washington, where I know many of us ran into him many times, again, because Ken's a dynamo and he works on a lot of different areas. And I think just lastly, a lesser known fact that Ken is also a drummer for the group Los Fat Beagles, who I'm hoping with the resumption of life after the pandemic that they'll make a North American tour and come to the US. Ken, I'm going to let you go from there, and sorry for the unprepared remarks from me on that.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's good to see that my musical background has made it to the to my bios for these events, but thank you so much. So first of all, thank you, and thanks to the Farm Foundation and Cappy for the invitation to be here today to talk about the elements of climate actions and trade within the USMCA and how the actions that the three countries are taking in terms of facing this enormous challenge are affected or enhanced by what we have in the USMCA and also other trade agreements. So let me just begin by saying the obvious, which is that climate change is easily the biggest challenge, I think, that all countries face in the 21st century. In particular, when it comes to the issue which is of great interest to today's audience here, which is the development of sustainable agriculture. So we have to see global climate change as a major food security threat to the world. In the case of Mexico specifically, because of our location, you know, between two oceans, our latitude, our topography, Mexico is a country that's very vulnerable to weather phenomena and to climate change impacts. The temperature is expected to increase by around an average of 2 degrees Celsius over the next few years, and rainfall especially is expected to decline in the northern region of Mexico in between 40 and 50%, and in the southern regions between 20 and 30%. So this will have a big impact on agriculture, especially on small producers who are very vulnerable because they lack irrigation systems. There's a high level of soil degradation, and they operate mostly in mountainous terrain. And 70% of the food that's consumed in Mexico comes from small producers who produce under these conditions. Fisheries are also under threat from overfishing, pollution, and other factors that affect marine life. And I think what I'm describing here applies to many other countries in the world, so it's a global issue. Now, at the end of my presentation, I will briefly address some of the measures that are being taken by the Mexican government to address the challenge of climate change and agriculture, but since our focus of the panel is on how these issues addressed in USMCA, I will focus on that. I think Darci did an excellent job in outlining some of the key elements within North America that are addressed in our trade agreement, both before in the NAFTA and now in the USMCA. I will address some of those issues later. I will focus now on the environmental chapter itself, because it's interesting how it has been debated, you know, whether USMCA fails at addressing climate change, whether there's opportunities for cooperation going forward. So it's interesting to stop there for a second and look at what it actually contains. So the environmental chapter in the USMCA is by far the most advanced chapter in any FTA that has been negotiated. Darci alluded to the fact that it includes provisions in a standalone chapter as opposed to the side agreement structure that it had in the NAFTA. And the most important part is that it has teeth. In other words, it is subject to the same dispute settlement provisions as other chapters, which is completely different as the way it operated under the NAFTA. Now, violations and environmental violations can be deemed actionable under the environmental chapter of the USMCA if they are done in a manner that affects trade and investment and are sustained and recurrent. And this is important because the object of trade agreements is not to establish environmental policy or labor policy or other policy that is closely related to trade agreements, but that is handled on a national basis. What it intends to do is to ensure that no artificial or unjustified benefits or competitive advantages are given by virtue of violating environmental and labor provisions as well. And I joined them because you know, they were both side agreements in the NAFTA and are now standalone independent chapters. So the environmental chapter in USMCA establishes clear commitments to properly implement domestic environmental protection laws and regulations, to enhance international cooperation. There are elements there that are very positive in terms of promoting the protection of coastal and marine environments, seeking to improve air quality. There are specific commitments to fulfill the obligations established in 7 multilateral environmental agreements, the MEAs, which include, for example, when we talk about the importance of climate change, include the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances. So that's something that's very relevant. It requires environmental impact assessments for government projects, and I will talk about that a little bit when we talk about some of the Mexican domestic policies that are being implemented right now. I mentioned air quality and sustainable fisheries management. And I think a key element that will serve in terms of future cooperation on climate change and in the North American region is the fact that we established trilaterally an environmental cooperation agreement that brings to the USMCA a lot of the elements that were established in the side agreement on NAFTA, which establishes the possibility that the institutional structure to have cooperation activities between the USMCA parties and maintains the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, the CEC. Now, it is clear when you look at the environmental chapter of the USMCA that it supports sustainability, but there are 2 key words missing, which is climate change. And Darci mentioned that already. It was a very difficult political negotiation, not just in the environmental chapter, but the overall renegotiation of the NAFTA, which turned into the USMCA. There were very strong political positions, primarily on the issue of the environment by the Trump administration, which did not want to have any references specifically to climate change or to the commitments of the Paris Agreement. As you know, the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement when the Trump administration came into power, and this was reflected in the dynamics of the USMCA negotiation. Now, pollution and conservation issues are addressed, and commitments to lower greenhouse gas emissions exist in ways that no previous agreements have it. But for example, we do not have, precisely because of this sort of pushback on having specific climate change obligations, there is no mention of, for example, carbon emission clauses or targets on renewable energy, which some other agreements have. For example, the EU-Mercosur agreement has a commitment to promote domestic and international carbon markets, or in the agreements between the EU and Japan. But it is also interesting to signal that in those other trade agreements, a lot of these provisions are not subject to dispute settlement. You see, they're just put forward as cooperation elements, where the elements that are put in the USMCA, the provisions that exist in the USMCA environmental chapter, are subject to dispute settlement. So the agreement does mention carbon storage and sequestration in sustainable forest management section in the chapter. It talks about clean technology development in the section on environmental goods. And so climate change related issues are included in the agreement, but they had to be included in a more sort of roundabout fashion that we would have wanted, at least I know Mexico and Canada, precisely because of these political restrictions in the negotiation. Now, I do believe that there are positive new elements that were added to the USMCA once the negotiation had concluded in the process where the Trump administration negotiated with a Democrats-led House of Representatives in order to get their support for the agreement. I don't usually agree with a lot of the additional elements that were added in the agreement on the labor chapter and other things on biologics, but I think that there were clear positive elements when it comes to environment, because for one thing, it does establish a solid commitment to maintain and implement the 7 multilateral environmental agreements. So additional languages that allows parties to agree to commit to these is included as part of that addendum to the USMCA. I think it's positive that an interagency committee was created in the US to conduct an assessment of current environmental landscape in all 3 countries. There's a sensitive provision there for Mexico, which is also included in the labor chapter, which has to do with the participation of let's say, environmental observers from the US government in Mexico to ensure that there's compliance with the provisions. But I think at the end of the day, if handled correctly, this can actually contribute to further cooperation in the area instead of being seen as an incisive element of intervention, let's say, in domestic affairs in Mexico. It really depends how that is implemented. There's also a new customs verification mechanism to ensure that only legally harvested and taken flora and fauna are traded in the North American countries. So I think that's very positive, in addition to new authorizations to the NAD Bank, the North American Development Bank, funding for EPA grants on the Border Water Infrastructure Program. So all of those additional elements, I think, bolster the environmental chapter and the approach that can be taken on climate change. Now, turning a little bit to Mexico, and with the issue that I started discussing at the beginning of the presentation, Mexico, as you know, is a member of the Paris Agreement, and we have launched an ambitious program actually on climate change for the agricultural and fisheries sectors in Mexico. This is something that is ongoing. Some of the main objectives include reducing vulnerability to climate change, increasing resilience in agriculture, trying to decouple the increase in agricultural production in Mexico from greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon footprint in general. So among the main actions are included establishing efficient water management and conservation systems, which is a big challenge in Mexico. While a lot of the agricultural activity is a result of rainfall, seasonal rainfalls, and not irrigation systems. Now, implementing as well sustainable fisheries and coral reef conservation programs are also being introduced. And some specific actions that are more technical, but that are important, such as reducing the practice of soil burning and improving soil conservation techniques throughout Mexico. Now, in terms of some of the challenges, of course, this implies further budgets, investments, experts in the field, and that's an area that, because of many austerity programs that Mexico is implementing, budgets have been reduced in order to do this. So what I can say is that the program itself on paper is very positive. I think it's headed in the right direction, but the question is whether the Mexican government will be able to implement it fully, and that's a big question mark. Now, just heading into the conclusion of my remarks, I think that although climate change is not featured front and center in USMCA, as perhaps we would have wanted, we made sure to include the provisions and the institutional structure that allows for future trilateral cooperation on this major challenge. As I mentioned, the ECA, the Environmental Cooperation Agreement, and some of the provisions on air quality, ozone layer protection, water pollution, etc., subsidies on fisheries, etc., I think work in that direction. And I do believe that the three countries should consider, now that there's been a sort of a change in the political winds, to insert specific climate change provisions. This should be a goal, perhaps, of the first comprehensive 6-year review of the USMCA, which you know is a mechanism that was introduced to have a comprehensive review on the implementation of the agreements and agree trilaterally whether other areas should be negotiated or included. And I think strengthening the climate change provisions would be something very positive. Now, Darci pointed to this. The key, of course, is political will. I mean, I think the policy changes under the Biden administration can lead to increased cooperation between the USMCA partners. In fact, President Biden, not only is the US joining the Paris Agreement, but President Biden has called on Mexico and Canada to accompany the US in major international climate and change initiatives, which I think could be very positive. Now, the challenge from a domestic perspective in Mexico is that despite our leadership on climate change over the last decade internationally, several policies, some of these related to the austerity measures that I've pointed out, but other policies that are being implemented right now would seem to be going in the wrong direction. For example, when it comes to environmental impact assessments, these are not being fully conducted in the top infrastructure projects that the Mexican government is implementing. For example, the ambitious Mayan train initiative in the Yucatan Peninsula, the refinery that is being built in Tabasco called Dos Bocas, and the Santa Lucia International Airport. There's still time to correct this, but this is something that's very important, that the government, in order to be in full compliance of our international commitments, must conduct these environmental impact assessments. Also, as I mentioned, environmental regulators, among others, in agriculture and in other areas have seen budget reduced and have started to lose operational autonomy and independence from the executive, which can be an important issue. And some of these elements are actually included in the USMCA's obligations to have independent regulators. And the most salient one that I see is an active energy policy to do away with the energy reform that was conducted in 2013, which allowed for further investment by private actors in energy in Mexico. And specifically, changes to the electricity law that were recently approved and that are now being challenged in Mexican domestic courts work against is generating incentives for renewable energies. So these changes in the electricity law that will favor the use of fuel oil and coal for power generation, coupled with, for example, possible backtracking on regulation to allow ethanol, specifically E10 as an oxygenate in gasolines, which would allow removal of over 4 million tons of CO2 annually, are problematic, right? So when you look at the changes in electricity law, this possible backtracking on regulations that allow biofuels to be used as oxygenates represent challenges. They represent a challenge bilaterally in the relationship with the United States. We know that this has been put at the forefront of some of the trade irritants that are rising right now. But at the same time, you know, there's other areas in agriculture, such as some policies to reduce the imports of biotechnology products from agriculture from the United States, whether it's cotton seed, other products, and initiatives to try to reduce the import of US corn because it's GMO corn. So I think that it's very timely right now for Mexico and the US to sit down and review all of these policies, whether we're talking about energy policy, policies on biotechnology, because at the end of the day, you know, we can be impacting environment negatively. For example, on agriculture biotechnology, when you close the market, for example, in Mexico for the export of cotton seed imports, what you wind up doing is affecting the environment because you're fomenting the entry of counterfeit seed into Mexico, which is not regulated. You know, the normal, regular, improved GMO cotton seed coming into Mexico is regulated under our law. By shutting it down completely, you're forcing the agricultural community to be bringing seed from who knows where and with what environmental impact. And also the use of GMO cotton seed, for example, in Mexico has allowed to a reduction in half of the amount of insecticides that you have to use on the crops in Mexico. So a lot of these policies, you know, should be looked at in terms of their impact on productivity in Mexico, but also an environmental conservation and the health of Mexicans as well. Just to conclude, I totally agree with what Darci mentioned in terms of the importance of regulatory convergence in SPS. I think that's very important. We should see the same, hopefully, on GMOs in the future in terms of a regulatory convergence of aligning methodologies, quality controls, etc. And I do believe the chapter on competitiveness also opens up an umbrella there to have further cooperation on this very important issue. So with that, I will leave it, and I'm open to, of course, questions and answers as we continue this session. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Ken, excellent, and thanks so much. I'm going to turn to our third speaker in just a moment. I'm going to remind everyone after Jonathan's done, we're going to go to a question and answer period. And so I want you thinking about questions, and you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a point where, or a thing, a Q&As where you can type in your question, and we can get to those in a minute. But first, our last speaker is Jonathan Freed, who's a senior advisor with the Albright Stonebridge Group and senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Both of those are here in DC. He's also an advisor to the Llewellyn Consulting in London. Jonathan served in many positions in the Canadian government, including Canada's permanent ambassador to the WTO from 2012 to 2018, where we ran into each other a few times there. Jonathan held some very important key positions at the WTO while he was there. He was chair of the General Council and also a chair of the very important dispute settlement body. And so with that, Jonathan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Joe, thanks very much, and a warm welcome to our participants. Whether or not you were able to participate in day one, by all means do go back, if not, and review the recordings. It's been a remarkably rich and diverse series of discussions. And at this stage, maybe 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the conference, it's humbling to be asked to provide some value added. You've gone into depth on the mechanics of possible implementation of carbon measures, including at the border. You've had a good discussion of Paris, but you've also danced around, and we have this morning as well, broader environmental issues. And both by way of consolidation of what's been discussed so far and to anticipate the closing sessions this afternoon, I think one of the things I could do usefully for you is to try and put the central focus, climate change. And as Darci and Ken both said, we have a primordial issue for the future of the planet as the focus of the conference, but place the climate change agenda in the broader international environmental context. And I begin by flagging that alongside the active discussion that will unfold this year on climate change through President Biden's climate summit onward to so-called COP26 that will be hosted by the United Kingdom later in the year, you have another COP this year, a conference of the parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity that will take place in China in October. The Secretariat for the CBD is actually headquartered in Montreal, so I have a special affinity for them, but also because this convention, as those of you working the land know full well, takes an ecosystems approach and connects the dots between soil and air and other resources, takes account of the transfer of technology that Ken referred to, the sharing of science and knowledge. And although it doesn't have directly binding automatic commitments, it has influence and will continue to influence in a meaningful way domestic policies in our three countries in a USMCA or CUSMA, as we call it in Canada, context, but also globally as well. And of course, all of this in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. We've heard mention in this panel already of goal number 2 on zero hunger. That was discussed in your food security panel, but if you take a quick glance through, look at how many of the SDGs relate directly to agricultural production and distribution, clean water, climate action, responsible production as well as consumption in number 12, life on land, number 15, clean energy, number 7, all of which, of course, as well as good health and well-being, all of which will affect the farmers' decisions, the processors' decisions, the transporters' decisions, the retailers' decisions, and ultimately consumer decisions on what is climate responsible and more broadly sustainable agricultural production going forward. So whether you're in the public policy community, in business or advising or in government, my fundamental message is pay attention to the context. All of these fronts are unfolding in parallel in multiple fora. I won't put in a plug that you need to hire Darci or her firm or Ken and his firm, but there are experts around that can round out your picture. And whether you set up a Google alert or otherwise, as I say, while climate change will get a lot of attention, because of the EU Green Plan, because of Biden's push, and here in Canada, led by former Governor Mark Carney, a focus on financing of the necessary climate change transition and the financial risk that goes to lenders that they'll have to account for, recalling the metrics that Joe referred to. These things are going on in parallel as well. And they are forming part of what is an overall movement that's palpable globally, that people shorthand as ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors, that first and foremost will be tested by the markets, by those who have money to deploy, whether official creditors, major pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, banks, or lenders. And ultimately, each of you, especially in a corporate context, will increasingly be asked by your shareholders, by the consumers, by the media, to report on meeting the metrics, and I'll come back to the metrics, on each of those pillars, from environment to social to governance, and ultimately all of the SDG criteria. So let's go on to the next slide. We've heard referenced in the USMCA to the fact that there are 7 multilateral environmental agreements listed. And they're not just listed as an acknowledgement that countries are free to enter into, but over and above that, in effect, it's a recognition that the 3 countries, any of the 3 who choose to comply with those environmental agreements and take measures that are built into those agreements with trade effects, cannot be held liable under the USMCA for doing so. Well, that's a small piece of the puzzle. Again, to reinforce my message that we need to put things into context. At current count, there's a bit of treaty congestion in the international environmental field. There's over 250 different multilateral environmental agreements dealing with everything from air to water to fisheries and so on. And according to WTO analysts and the secretariat within them, 15 are very specific in demanding trade measures. Most well known, I think, among the general public is CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. You know, you can't conduct trade in ivory, for example. And of course, we all sign on to that global agreement to say we'll take the necessary measures, not only to try and stop the poaching, but to make sure there is no transport, no importation, no marketing of those measures. That's considered legitimate, notwithstanding the WTO general rules that say you can't put measures at the border to restrain trade or to target foreigners. So again, I know it's an impossible task when you have full-time work to produce food and to make sure it makes it from the farm gate to the food plate, as we say in Canada, to keep track of all this. But through your industry associations, your non-governmental, non-profit organizations, including CAPI and the Farm Foundation, and the good academic research underway, you need to keep an eye out, because each of these has potential impact on how to conduct and develop more productive and more sustainable agriculture. And some of them more specific to particular commodities, such as timber or lumber. We heard about that. Some of it having to do with inputs, such as pesticides and chemicals, and some of them to do with your associated dependency on on tractors and fuel and how to dispose of the wastes that are produced as a result. So all of which is to say, it's a bigger universe out there. No doubt Cappy and the Farm Foundation will continue to delve into other dimensions beyond climate change itself, because each of these has an impact. So the next slide, if I may. We've danced around, and if you go back, those of you who participated in the Asia Pacific Perspectives panel and Mr. Heath from the Australian Farm Institute highlighted that all of this takes place while the international community regulates a series of standards for food safety and food quality. Darci highlighted Codex, the IPPC, and the Organisation Mondiale de la Santé Animale, the International Epizootics Organization, easier to say OIE. And although we've set up most of the discussion so far as being Paris plus WTO, again, Aaron Fowler highlighted this as he, in his work, has had to go back and forth between the FAO and the WTO to sort out who's doing what to whom. Here's the World Health Organization itself, obviously preoccupied with COVID, but having a much broader mandate, as the co-owner with the FAO in setting up and administering Codex Alimentarius, which is the international code for safe food, and particularly live animals, because there is a health dimension in terms of what you and I can consume, and there is a sustainability dimension that the FAO is also concerned about. These are staffed, not these meetings and these standards are set not by diplomats going over, but by experts, veterinarians, and scientists. In fulfillment of Darci's plea and Ken's endorsement that standards be set, administered, and implemented on a risk and science-based foundation. The same can be said under the International Plant Protection Convention. It's really the mirror image of Codex and the OIE for things that grow out of the ground, again, staffed by experts, the plant scientists rather than the veterinarians there, and the OIE headquartered in Paris to protect the health of animals and ultimately the human consumer as well. They're known as the Three Sisters in a WTO context because in administering this sanitary and phytosanitary measures agreement in terms of what is a legitimate restriction on trade as opposed to an arbitrary or unjustifiable or otherwise trade distortive restrictions, the WTO rules in effect say if you're internationally benchmarked in your domestic measures and you're implementing in good faith a Codex, IPPC, or OIE standard, that's okay. And you're not offside for doing so. And as Ken and Darci underscored, that's reinforced and highlighted in a USMCA context. So again, sorry to dwell on the point, but it's an oversimplification just to say the only things at issue are WTO on the one hand and the Paris Accord on climate change on the other. These all affect the conduct of agriculture and agri-food production and distribution. Increasingly, and as you've heard in other panels, Codex, the IPPC, and the OIE will themselves, in the future of standard setting, begin increasingly to integrate climate-related standards into their respective codes as well. So it's not that you just add another column, it's that you be aware of the intersection between climate and this standard setting. Which brings me to a broader point, if I may, on the next slide. We can click ahead, and that is, all right, so we're talking about standards here. This is from, the left side is from the Washington Post. And the bottom half just gives some examples of various labels and standards that purport to give the consumer some assurance of quality. And if you look in the middle under the food column, 19 different standards from the Fair Trade Coalition to the USDA standard of what's organic and so on. And in the upper half, how many global standards or standards that apply around the world that might affect the labeling and good housekeeping seal of approval for food. You can count 90 of them. Well, who says they're legitimate? Who actually has a metric where one agrees with the other? There's a bit of shopping that goes on among industry and commodity associations as to how to earn whose label. These are private standards. I don't mean private solely in the profit-making private sector sense, but private in the sense that they're non-governmental. Ironically, in a WTO context, while some of these issues have been highlighted, there's been some resistance, including from developing countries, to discussing private standards as being not governmental measures, not the business of the WTO, even though the arbitrariness of some of the insistence, let's say from a retailer saying, I need to see some sort of label on your bag of coffee, whether it's fairly grown, organically planted, or what have you, can be to the detriment of what would otherwise be legitimate and potentially, by any independent assessment, reasonably responsible. The right-hand side gives you an idea around the world of just how many there are. That tells us, and Ted Billier and others can comment from experience, what it means to be asked for and to go shopping for whose certification for what purposes. Having said all that, the bottom of the screen says there are some legitimate, globally recognized certification. Many of you in the industry know about HACCP standards, the Global Partnership for Good Agricultural Practice, and the international food standards that we talked about that emanate out of Codex. This is an area crying out, as Joe hinted at, for some harmonization, some standardization. Why do I say that? Because we're seeing, whether on labor standards and worker rights that Ken alluded to, whether on environmental standards, as the earlier discussions highlighted regarding the EU Green Plan, or otherwise, a call for accountability and traceability. That in turn says, even to the ultimate retailer, for example, do you know where your goods came from? And do you know how they were produced? As you've heard throughout the conference, that's very palpable in the climate context, because at some point people may be asked to put on their label, what is the carbon footprint of your final product? And of course, all the debates about measurement, does that include food miles and the indirect carbon consumption that goes into its production? Is agriculture going to be exempt, as some of your earlier speakers suggested, or not? But can you testify for this packaged product that the farm on which it was grown was treating its harvesters and workers fairly, that there was no forced labor, that there was no child labor, that there was gender equality, or what have you? Just to give you a flavor of how extreme this can become. The German parliament, just within the last month, has passed a draft law. It hasn't reached Chancellor Merkel's desk yet, but it says that for any enterprise employing 3,000 people, which is a significant size enterprise, but could include grocery trains as well as automotive factories, they must account for and be able to document and certify every step of the supply chain abroad for every input into what they're selling and distributing. And they're exposed to civil law, private lawsuits in Germany if they're not abiding by recognized standards or helping to enforce those recognized standards anywhere upstream in their supply chain. You're beginning to see a few little signs of that in some particularly egregious areas. For example, the alleged slave labor or forced labor in Xinjiang and abuse of human rights in China, where a number of cotton products originate. This goes back, if those of you old enough to remember the terrible tragedy in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, where an overcrowded textile factory, not safe conditions, and unfair labor practices regarding primarily the women who worked there collapsed, and that called for better traceability and transparency on textiles trade, thus far largely voluntary. But I anticipate over the coming years that, building on everything you've heard Wednesday and today, and you may hear more this afternoon, that the kinds of demands for traceability, accountability, and transparency all along the supply chain will inevitably increase. That does, in my view, invite governments not only at home individually, but with each other to develop some common approaches. And coming full circle back to USMCA, there's an open opportunity for us in North America to reach some common approaches on what we expect in the marketplace, in the name of consumer empowerment, in the name of environmental sustainability, but also in the name of fostering efficient, productive, and responsible agricultural practices. Climate, as I said, just to finish up, is very much a central part of this, but as I've tried to show, not at all exhausting the universe of the kinds of metrics and documentation and reporting that unfold in a broader environmental and sustainability context. So let me stop there in light of the time and join in the Q&A and chat as we go. Thank you, Joe.
Great, Jonathan. Thanks so much. Just an excellent panel. Let's, we have about a half hour for Q&As. I see we already have 4. I was going to start with letting the panelists comment to one another, but I think instead of doing that, let's go to the questions first so we get some audience participation. The first question is, I would be interested in some comments on how Mexico and Canada might be able to work together in refining the trading and environmental relationship with the US under the USMCA, particularly where they might where there may be domestic U.S. interests in advancing Buy American and other potential trade barriers like that. When do you want to take a shot at it?
Well, maybe I'll answer a bit from the US perspective and then we can get others. But, you know, I think that, first of all, yes, you see an emphasis on Buy American, you see an emphasis on looking at, are there particular sectors of the economy, are there particular supply chains where having domestic supply and domestic production is important. And I don't think the US is the only country looking at that, particularly post-COVID or during COVID, and looking at, you know, medical supplies first and foremost. I think from the last administration and into this one, there's also a focus on sort of core industries, steel and aluminum, and, you know, is there a national interest in having at least some core element of these important industries? You know, big discussions around you know, the chip industry and what it means if there's not enough global supply, what that's doing in our auto plants. So I don't think the US is the only country having that discussion or thinking about how it balances sort of having, again, core domestic supplies, but also being actively participating in international trade. In the context of NAFTA or USMCA, I think it's interesting to note that there have been comments by the administration to say, when we say Buy America, there may be certain instances where that becomes Buy North America, and where we are cognizant of the fact that already, you know, even in our defense contracts and some of our most core industries, we're used to having certain products cross the border back and forth a number of times between, you know, iron ore and finished good. And so I think in terms of the USMCA relationship, the question is there some of tweaking or balancing in how those Buy America provisions are implemented? And can they take account a little bit of a regional approach? And I don't have the answer to that, but we have seen, you know, some statements here and there that there's some opening in looking at and taking into account how integrated our economies already are.
If I may
Great,
comment,
yeah, go
Mexico
ahead,
side.
Ken.
Thank you, Joe. I think that from the Mexican perspective, there's been concerns with the Buy American provisions for many years. You know, now, regardless of the particular administration that is in power in the U.S. But recently, I think that the concern over the last few years has been with the growing economic nationalism. This is not something that's just happening in the US. It's happening everywhere and getting exacerbated because of the economic crisis caused by the COVID crisis. So countries tend to look inward and to try to protect themselves. And many times that protection translates into trade protectionism, which in reality, as we have seen throughout history, only exacerbates the crisis even further. So I think when we talk about economic nationalism, there is a concern, I think, in Mexico that despite the Trump administration's departure, you know, there's a lot of people in the U.S. that believe that the U.S. is losing out from globalization. And there's this perception that by trying to force investment to stay in the U.S., you know, for companies not to leave and invest elsewhere, that is something that is positive for the U.S. economy. Now, I think that one of the tasks, and the USMCA helps towards this, is for the three governments to sit down and really start looking at our region as an economic bloc, right? It's a single production perimeter where, by virtue of producing together all three countries, we reduce costs, we increase quality, and we're able to compete efficiently with the rest of the world. So looking at a little bit at the concept that Darcy's mentioning, I think is very good, the concept of Buy North American, right? I mean, there's enormous benefits to be had when a US company invests in Mexico, follows the USMCA rules and guidelines, including all of the elements of environmental protection, worker rights protections, et cetera, standards, et cetera, and exports to the rest of the world. When a company from the US that invests in Mexico exports to the rest of the world, 40% of the content comes from the US, right? So when Mexico exports, in fact, the US is exporting as well. And throughout North America, salaries in export-oriented jobs are higher than in the rest of the economy. In the case of Mexico, it's almost 40% higher than the salaries in the rest of the economy. So really looking at the concept of Buy North American and anchored on the standards and the rules that are established in the USMCA is really the way to go. Any policies that try to punish companies that invest abroad, that create disincentives for that type of private sector activity, it really hurts North America. So I think that the countries should look at it as something that can really strengthen North American cooperation and especially competitiveness. At the end of the day, it's going to help our three economies if we stop looking at Mexico, US, and Canada as rivals rather than as partners in this effort. I mean, it sounds idealistic, but I really think 25 years of successful NAFTA have proven it. You know, the integration between supply chains, whether you're talking about electronics, automotive, you know, aerospace, but also in the agricultural and agri-food sectors is enormous. So we should really value that and pursue that further in the future.
Jonathan, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, I was going to try and respect the time and the additional questions, but very quickly, Buy America has to do with government procurement and what the government purchases. The broader question of economic nationalism, of course, as Ken highlighted, is a slightly different issue. We've experienced in North America lots of that in the agri-food sector over many years. Be it and it's largely by commodity, be it the Florida tomato growers being concerned, or avocado people being concerned about Mexican imports, the Midwestern wheat people being concerned about the higher quality of Canadian durum, not to put in a sales pitch there, or country of origin labeling for meat. Despite the fact that all our agri-food trade patterns are largely north-south, including for the harvesters who move according to the weather across the border, as they have for over 100 years, both to plant and to harvest in spring or fall. So thus far, the NAFTA, USMCA, and WTO rules have served reasonably well to protect us against the abuses of a claim for national preference and allowing the interrelated trade to thrive. Again, recalling cattle and meat, for example. Good Canadian cows often end up on the US side of the border for slaughter. Or for freezing and packaging. Does that make it a Canadian or an American steak when it reaches the market? Can you apply automotive rules to talk about trade change of tariff classification or value added to conclude that? That's sort of irrelevant if you have an efficient and integrated North American production and distribution chain. Let me stop there.
Okay, great, and thanks. And we'll move on to the next question, and this is more back to specifically USMCA, and that's just the question whether USMCA will help. Well, there, I just got the question was, I just lost the question. Oh, there it is. Sorry. It will help or hinder the three countries' cooperation on climate change solutions. And what do you, the panelists, think needs to be done moving forward to ensure cooperation between US, Mexico, and China? And maybe if we can try to keep our answers short, we'll get to be able to get through all the questions. So thanks. So let me, Darci, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. I mean, I think two things. One is, you know, I tried in my remarks to say there's all of these committees, institutions, meetings that happen to implement NAFTA or implement USMCA and our trade agreements. And, you know, to be perfectly honest, having chaired a number of those committees over my career, they're often like the list of grievances. What's not quite working? You know, can we finally get our potatoes into Mexico? What about those Mexican avocados into the US? Like there's a list of things that are the trade irritants. And that's how we've often used our committee time, right? If we use that time and the bringing together of trade and environment officials together to say, okay, wait, what's a bigger common challenge like climate, like this, increasing subsidization of key industries like we see in China, or not following international standards? You know, what are the common problems we might be having with our exports? We could be using that time with experts around the table to say, what's the role of USMCA in the larger trading environment? And we haven't done that before, but what I think is interesting about the Biden administration's approach around trade is they're very much talking about it as one larger component of foreign and economic policy. And, you know, very much talking about trade priorities being set around the intersection between trade and the environment, trade and labor, trade and human rights. And so, you know, can we use our institutions in a different way to maybe line ourselves up for future strategic initiatives? Realizing that these bilateral irritants and solving problems, that's going to remain important. But I think what's interesting about 25 years of being bound by a trade agreement is that what we have as US, Canadian, and Mexican officials, to use a baby boomer word, we have deep Rolodexes, right? We know each other, and these long relationships. And so with some of our other trading partners, that meeting of the trade committee is the only time we see each other. That's not really how we operate because we're so integrated with US, Mexico, and Canada. So I would say maybe we can use our institutions a little bit better and be more forward-leaning. And then the second is, I think we have to ask ourselves whether USMCA is the right fora on doing things like challenging some of China's behavior. We want to look at the group of countries who have similar approaches. We may need a much bigger alliance. We may need countries that have, industries that are combined in a way, and maybe that's Canada and Mexico. Maybe it's a slightly different group if you think about, steel and aluminum, where we're working with the EU and Japan. But we should be looking for alliances around approaches like that. And we shouldn't be afraid to work not just North America, but North America and others when we're working on these bigger issues too.
Great. Either of you want to take a shot as well, or? Okay, we can move on to, let's move on to the next question then. This question is, it says USMCA adds many new disciplines and expectations regarding trilateral coordination on environmental, labor, health issues, infrastructure, et cetera. But in the past, at least, those efforts, at least on the previous NAFTA agreement, largely failed because at the end of the day, the national ministries, departments responsible for these areas do not report to the trade ministries and consider trade and regulatory cooperation obligations to be a nuisance or contrary to immediate domestic political imperatives. And I think, if you look at a lot of regulatory agencies, the first and foremost, they regulate. And so they don't necessarily like to hear from a trade rep's office or whatever saying, hey, we need to change our rules because we made an agreement that we'll do so. So how do you address those? How do you fix those? Anyone? Ken, you want to start? Or go ahead, Jonathan. You're raising your hand. I'll let Ken jump in afterwards.
I see this comes from Rory McAlpin, who's a bit mischievous because he has a wealth of knowledge and experience in the field. But I think, and I'm old enough to go back to the original NAFTA, one of the things that has changed significantly over the last 25 years is that while many of the regulators, as you say, Joe, according to their statute and regulations, would say, look, we're paid to regulate. We don't have in our budget or in our mandate spending a lot of time on international affairs. If you look at the various agencies and ministries and departments, almost every one of them now has a built-in international cooperative unit or agenda because they each appreciate, as we see with Codex and OIE and so on, that a lot of the regulation has its origin and its base in an international benchmark. So they need to actively participate in shaping that, and they need to actively bring it back to implement. So that's true both multilaterally, internationally, and domestically. And I think that has evolved. So you combine that with the goodwill we heard from Darci and Ken, I think the prospects for more meaningful engagement, cooperation, and action in these various committees and the additional working groups that Darci highlights are much better than in the past. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Ken.
A quick comment. I think that one of the key elements that sort of changes the game quite a bit, at least when it comes to environmental and labor provisions in the USMCA versus the NAFTA, is precisely the fact that it's subject to dispute settlement. I mean, if you look at the labor provisions, the fact that there's a specific annex on union democracy, which is new for all trade agreements, that has a rapid response mechanism that can lead to quick panels and imposition of potential retaliation or trade barriers. In the area of the environment, having it subject to dispute settlement, it really actually can help when the discussion is taking place between trade officials and regulators in other areas of the government to place a sense of urgency as to the impact that non-compliance can have immediately on trade and, of course, the economy of the country. Basically, by virtue of having, these trade commitments established and the fact that if you don't comply with them, you can get hit with trade, either retaliation or trade barriers can be erected, that changes the dialogue internally between the agencies. And I would take issue with the comment in the question that says that other areas also failed before because of regulatory pushback. If you look at the NAFTA, for example, for over 84 years, Mexico had not been able to get avocados into the US because there was this claim that there was fruit flies that affected it and they couldn't be allowed into the US. Well, once the working groups in the NAFTA got going, slowly but surely we were able to open that market, not completely fully right now as we would want to. The same was true for swine fever, for example, classical swine fever. So it takes time, but the fact that you have this international commitment that is basically a give and take, where you know that if you use regulatory measures to close trade coming into your country, the same will happen to you, and that has a direct cost. I think that changes the game and it forces a more constructive dialogue, let's say, between trade authorities and regulators. Obviously, there's a very difficult balance there and a constant tug of war. But I think in the USMCA, we may see a different approach, hopefully, on environment and labor because of the fact that they're subject to dispute settlement.
Great. Okay, so we're getting down to about 10 more minutes. We got 3 questions left, I believe, here. So I'm going to try to get through them all. The next one is just in the current systems, there's a mix between a focus on how things are grown and a focus on what is eaten. So the difference sort of between a production focus and actually the food itself. And if is the only way to both integrate environmental impact of the entire food chain and provide consumers with information, or excuse me, the statement here is a focus on food is the only way to both integrate environmental impact of the entire food chain and provide consumers with information on the impact of their consumption choices. And so if I can get someone to answer a question, what their views are on focus on production standards versus food standards as it relates to food. Anyone want to take that?
Very quickly, the answer is both. It's not an either or proposition. The global supply chain, as we've heard, whether it's cotton or the cow or beef or grain or whatever, is a cross-border supply chain. Unless you overload in a carbon and other context, all the requirements for the retailer to do all that traceability at every step along the way, you want to share that burden and accountability pretty well among each of those stages. And the WTO rules on subsidization and incentives and standards and so on will also look at the producer's commodity, not just the final food product to assess the fairness in trade of that intermediate product or good or raw material as well. I better keep it short.
No, thanks, Jonathan. So let me go to the next question, and that's much of the environment and climate change structure in USMCA is reflective of history and previous administrations looking in the rearview mirror. The private sector has been moving ahead of governments in trade rules, and we talked a little about private standards and other things. Can you look 10 years ahead and tell us what USMCA has missed or is weak in? And Darci, you have that ability. And if you can tell us what corn prices will be in 10 years too, I think all of us would appreciate that.
I'm not going there, Joe. But I think it partly like time will tell, right? And the question is, where we specified specific topics and agreements where we're going to cooperate on environment, were they with the right ones? Are they the things that, keep us on top of what the latest challenges are? In some ways, only time will tell. But I think back to my earlier comments about using it as sort of an incubator to think about how we address cross-border these common problems in the context of allies who already have strongly integrated economies. We should, think about using USMCA that way. But also, I think the last question about that private sector versus public sector role, we haven't quite figured that out yet when it comes to agriculture and trade and climate change. And, part of the reason that I went where I did in the private sector is because when it comes to things like safety, so food safety or specific, application of tariffs, worrying about language that's misleading to the public, government clearly has a mandate to do that. Where it comes to an expression of values around how a product is grown, how it treats, individuals that maybe isn't, where there's not a legal issue, but a desire to vote with your dollars. To encourage better relationships along the supply chain. The private sector is absolutely leading there, and the government plays catch up. Look at how long it took us to do biotech labeling in the US. We said there's not a safety issue here. We think the label implies either a favorability or discrimination against it. We don't want to touch it. And the industry said it's too late, like cat's out of the bag. People want to know this. We're going to come up with our own if you don't do it, decide. And so I think figuring out how government can support the infrastructure, the common measurement, we've talked about that before, fair application of these things so that consumers actually get something out of the label. And that if retailers, if the private sector are making pledges against climate commitments, et cetera, there's some way for governments then to dovetail their efforts and verify that all of those are actually doing what they claim. And so I think this is a little bit of a different territory for governments in figuring out how they can support and underpin private sector efforts as well as encourage them. And it won't always be just regulation. So I just think it's a really interesting time to watch how sort of who's leading on which element of this changes a little bit to make sure we all get where we need to go.
Great, and I'm going to follow your statement up with the last question, which I think dovetails into this and brings us full around to carbon markets, because here we're already seeing private markets develop for carbon. We're seeing governments. Jonathan talked about the challenges of private standards and their impact on trade. I mean, right now, say take something like GIs, where you see if you're doing a free trade agreement with the EU, you're going to go move one way. If you're doing it with the US and its other partners, it may be going another way. And so what is the potential here to use something like USMCA to develop common standards for carbon markets? And I guess the question being posed here is, will the three countries be prepared to align mechanisms that they are currently developing independently? And let me start, Jonathan, with you, and then we can move to Ken, and then Darci, you get the follow-up.
Sure, and I'm sure Darci and Ken will add. USMCA is a part of a truly North American network of cooperation in economic related fields. You know, 1/3 of Canada-US trade is automotive, but another 1/3 is energy, whether it's oil and gas or electricity. Quebec Hydro, a clean source of electricity, powers New York and New England. With Biden's green plan, with Pierre Trudeau's green plan, both of which point towards carbon pricing. And given the trade between us, be it automotive or energy, inevitably we will have to have agreed and common standards on a North American basis. Certainly in a Canada-US context, and I would expect that needs to be harmonized trilaterally. So in the same spirit as we began the discussion, and as Darci emphasized, pursuing a North American approach not only is to our mutual benefit in reinforcing this interdependence, but also can point the way and serve as an example to what we bring to the multilateral table in taking on Europe, or what we would expect China to adhere to as well.
Ken, you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Joe. I think the key here is that political will, I think, is the key element that's needed in order to be able to align public policies, to have common practices and standards, whether it's on environment, on energy. I think Jonathan touched upon something that's very important. I think when he speaks about energy integration and cooperation in North America, that is key. It is essential not only for competitiveness, because as we continue strengthening technological innovation and technology, and helping reduce the cost of energy and therefore helping competitiveness in our region, that is also directly linked to everything that we've been talking about today in terms of making progress towards climate change control and mitigation and facing up to this challenge. The big issue here is whether we are going to be able to develop common policies trilaterally. I pointed out that some of the energy policies being pushed forward in Mexico that would seem contrary to this idea of developing carbon markets, of developing common policies. I think that's something that needs to be aligned. There needs to be a discussion at the highest level between the three countries on the prospects of energy cooperation, and then stop seeing, at least in Mexico, energy as an issue that pits two adversaries, which is governments versus private actors. We need to get rid of that vision and be really ready to tackle what needs to be the future. I like the question before on the 10-year view of USMCA. I think one key element in the next 10 years is to develop these common practices, to be able to take the next big step, which is develop carbon markets in the three countries. And then not only that, link them to common regulations, common approaches. I think another aspect which is essential going forward is trilateral adoption of private standards, developing these private standards, trilaterally in our region to give them more legitimacy and have them evolve side by side with government regulations. So this sort of ideal view of the world may clash with what we're seeing right now, but I think that is the long-term solution to these issues. And energy and climate change are deeply interrelated, and they should be approached trilaterally, I think, in North America.
Great, thanks so much. Darci, you want to add anything here at the end?
Just really quickly, I think we have an opportunity to have really honest and important discussions on sharing data. So, if we try a carbon bank in the US, or we decide to subsidize sensors or access to goods or services around, entering carbon markets, what do those incentives do to farmer behavior? What does it change to what is produced? And therefore, what does that mean for what we're exporting or importing? How is it affecting our, fellow farmers who are so integrated into that North American market? And having some really honest discussions about that. If we try an experiment and it helps big farmers but not small ones, or there's a clear factor of that would influence farmers to participate or not, that's important for our neighbors to know when they try to design what's happening. And so again, I just think coming back to how those economic incentives ripple through the marketplace, how we share that experience, and then talk about, designing these programs in a way that are useful on the trade side, but also the environment side, knowing that we really need to get the most bang for our buck when it comes to mitigating climate change here. We have an opportunity to do that in a North American context.
Great. Well, that's going to conclude our panel, and I'll turn it back to Martha in just a second. But first, let me thank the panelists. This was excellent. I think thank the audience as well. Very good questions. You know, as moderator, you end up writing down a lot of questions in case you run out of time. Didn't have to do this. Thankfully, we got everything done on time. And then lastly, thanks to the interpreters. With that, Martha, it's all yours.
Thank you to Joe and all of our speakers. At this time, we will take a break until 1:00 p.m. Central Time. A reminder that the networking lounge is open and is a great way to continue the dialogue in between sessions. So remember to join the next session at 1:00 p.m. Central using the blue view session button from the event hub. We'll see you then.